Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. It's been a long old while since I last recorded an episode of the podcast. I was just thinking about it. I think it's been 7 weeks. That might be my longest ever hiatus. So there were a couple of weeks at Easter where I didn't record a podcast. And then since then, I've had an MA assignment that's been hanging over me, and I struggled to meet the deadline. I had to ask for a deadline extension. So I had to devote my Saturday mornings, which is when I would usually produce a podcast episode. I had to devote my Saturday mornings instead to working on my essay. But I submitted it on Tuesday. It's out the way now. And so I have plenty to talk about. And because I have plenty to talk about, and because it's also been such a long time since I released an episode, I'm going to record 2 episodes back to back. And they'll be released on consecutive weeks instead of the usual 2-week space between episodes. So I hope you enjoy. In this, the first of the back-to-back episodes, I would like to discuss a couple of ideas that I've heard about recently, which I think have interesting implications for teaching. The first one is something called the cylinder model. Now, my partner is doing a degree in psychology, and she recently did a module on cooperation, the psychology of cooperation. And the cylinder model was something that she found out about during this module and told me about. And it's very interesting. So the cylinder model comes out of work on negotiations, crisis negotiations. Think of things like a hostage negotiation situation. So some researchers listened back to hundreds of these dialogues between negotiators and whoever they were negotiating with, whether it was a hostage taker or someone else. But all of these situations involved a crisis that the negotiator was trying to resolve. And these researchers found that the successful negotiations had certain aspects in common. And they came up with this cylinder model in order to explain what was common amongst all of these successful negotiations. In order to explain what it was that made the best negotiators the best negotiators. So let me tell you a little bit about this cylinder model, and I will put some links in the show notes, so please check those out if you're interested. Now I'm just going to read to you, paraphrase perhaps, a couple of things from this article that I found online. So, one way of helping negotiators understand the concept of sense-making is to use the cylinder model. This model captures the way that people communicate through 3 dimensions. First, it characterizes 3 orientations people have towards interaction. So these 3 orientations are avoidant, for example, refusing to take responsibility for the event; competitive, for example, attacking the negotiator's ideas whilst boasting about their own; and the third orientation is cooperative, for example, making concessions or giving compliments. So these are 3 different ways in which someone could approach an interaction with a negotiator, or more generally, perhaps any sort of argument where a crisis is involved. Now, the cylinder model also characterizes 3 motivational frames related to the people's goals during the interaction. So these motivational frames are identity, for example, seeking to boast about their own self-worth, either through insulting the other person or interrupting them. instrumental, for example, trying to achieve an instrumental goal like getting information through bargaining, and relational, that's the third motivational frame. For example, empathizing with the other person or seeking to show where they share common traits. Now, how does all this help expert negotiators? And in particular, how is it going to help teachers? I'll get onto that in a minute. So, first of all, we've got those three orientations: avoidant, competitive, and cooperative. Those three orientations are stacked one on top of another. At the bottom of the cylinder, we have avoidant. In the middle, we've got competitive, and at the top, we've got cooperative. So obviously, the negotiator is trying to move up the cylinder towards the top, towards the cooperation level. Now, the suggestion from the researchers is that if you want to move up the cylinder from avoidant through competitive to cooperative and to resolve the crisis, then you need to adopt an orientation that's above the person you're talking to. So say if a negotiator is speaking to someone who's being very avoidant, so perhaps they're refusing to take responsibility for the event, then the negotiator should go one step above in the cylinder model and be competitive. The idea being here that by being competitive, you're going to challenge the person you're negotiating with and almost encourage them to step up to your level, onto the competitive level with you, and to compete with you. And if the person you're speaking to is being competitive, then again, you want to one-up them and head to the cooperative level, one above, where you can begin making concessions or giving compliments. And by constantly staying one step in the cylinder model above the person you're speaking to, you can move them from a position where they're perhaps avoiding taking responsibility for an event up to being cooperative and ultimately resolving the crisis. So that's to do with the three orientations. You're always meant to stay one above the person you're talking to if you're trying to resolve a crisis. So if they're avoidant, you need to be competitive. You almost need to challenge them, provoke them out of their avoidance. And if they're being competitive, you need to become cooperative, and that will help resolve the crisis. So that's the three orientations. Now, what about the three motivational frames? Remember, we had identity, we had instrumental, and we had relational. Now, here, whereas with the three orientations before, you wanted to kind of go one above the person you were speaking to, here, with the motivational frames, you want to match their motivational frame. So if it becomes clear that someone's motivation has to do with identity, so say if they are seeking to boost their own self-worth, then that is something that you would want to appeal to in resolving the crisis. If they are being instrumental in their motivation, if they're trying to achieve something, whether it's getting information or getting money or whatever it might be, again, you want to play into that instrumental motivation. And third, if they're being relational, so if they are empathizing with you or trying to point out traits that the two of you have in common, again, match it, play into that. So that's the cylinder model. And like I said, researchers came up with this cylinder model as a way to try to explain how expert negotiators successfully resolve crises in very extreme circumstances. So that's the model that they came up with. And I think it applies quite readily to education. And it's one of those wonderful pieces of research that once you have an idea about it, you start to see it playing out around you. I work with some wonderful colleagues, really expert teachers with decades of experience, who seem to have this magical effect on students. And especially when you're a new teacher, it really can seem like magic. You don't know how they're doing this, let alone being able to copy what they're doing. You can't even spot what it is they're doing. However, when you come across a piece of research like this, it can throw light on what it is that expert teachers are doing. And I think that some expert teachers who are incredibly competent when it comes to negotiating crises with students, or to having perhaps uncomfortable interactions with students, or resolving arguments with students, they do this intuitively. So if a student perhaps is avoiding taking responsibility for an event, then the teacher might adopt intuitively a more competitive stance to provoke them out of their avoidance and to engage in a more meaningful conversation about what has happened. And then from being competitive, you can then take the step up to being cooperative. So those were the three orientations where you kind of had to stay one step above the person you were speaking to. And when it comes to the three motivational frames, identity, relational, or instrumental, again, expert teachers do this. And here, it's crucial to know your students really well and to ask yourself, what motivates my students and how can I play into what it is that motivates them? So perhaps if you know that a student wants to be a certain sort of person, you can play into that. If they're doing something which seems inconsistent with their identity goals, then you can point to that and say, hang on, what are you doing here? That's not the behaviour of the sort of person that I know you want to be. And if they are motivated by relational considerations, so if they are driven first and foremost by those relationships, again, you can tap into that. You could say, what would your parents think about this? If you know they have a particularly strong relationship with their parents, even if you know they have a particularly strong relationship with another teacher, what would that teacher think about whatever it is that you've just done? Or if they're instrumentally oriented, maybe you've got a young man who's very motivated by earning lots of money when he's older, then you could encourage them to see their behaviour as stepping stones towards achieving their future goal, and how their current disruptive behaviour is undermining those stepping stones. So I thought this model was fascinating, and I'm very grateful to my partner for introducing it to me. And that is honestly just the most superficial treatment of this cylinder model of negotiation. I'll leave a link to the article below. Please go check it out. I think I might perhaps return to this in a future episode. We will see. And let me know if you think that this cylinder model makes sense of your experience of expert teachers and how they interact with students. Do you think that expert teachers intuitively do this sort of thing? I mean, I do. So that was the first idea I wanted to talk about today. Before I move on to the second idea, my usual Patreon plea. This episode, well, it's a back-to-back episode, so these two episodes today took about 4 hours in total to produce. So that's about 2 hours per episode, which is average. And that works out to usually 4 hours or so a month. So if you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, £2 to £3 a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution is greatly appreciated. As always, I'll leave a link in the show notes below. Thank you ever so much. Oh, I should mention also that if you sign up on Patreon, you'll have exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions. Now, the second idea I wanted to talk about, it's something I first heard about in a podcast. It was a Cautionary Tales podcast with Tim Harford, and it was about dictators. Again, I'll leave a link in the show notes below. And in this episode, Tim spoke about salami slicing tactics. I'd never heard of this before. Now, he introduced the idea first with an example of a child in a swimming pool. So first, the parent says, don't go in the swimming pool. So the child sits down on the edge of the swimming pool with just their feet in the swimming pool. The parent says, hang on a second. I told you not to go in the swimming pool. What are you doing? Child says, I'm not in the swimming pool. I've just got my feet in the swimming pool. Parent says, okay, fine. Next thing, the child is no longer sitting on the edge of the swimming pool, but is now standing in it. They still only have their feet in the pool, but now instead of sitting, they're standing. Parent says, what are you doing? Child says, it's still only my feet that are wet. Parent says, okay, fine. What does the child do next? Well, they start inching closer to the deep end. And you can see where this is going. The parent has gone from saying, do not go in the swimming pool, and then via a series of concessions, the child is now fully in the swimming pool, heading for the deep end. And the child achieved this by kind of just chipping away at the initial instruction not to go in the swimming pool, bit by bit. And this is called salami slicing tactics. And as you can see by this all too familiar example, it's something that children do intuitively. So why is it called salami slicing tactics? Well, the idea is that if someone's got a salami that you want, if you stole it all in one go, they probably wouldn't be very happy about it, and you might provoke considerable retaliation. However, if you just take one little slice at a time, they may not even notice. And if they do notice, they may think it's only a slice. But all of a sudden, if you do that often enough, then you've got a whole heap of slices of salami. In fact, you've got the whole salami. The other person's got nothing left, and they're left there wondering, what on earth happened to my salami? So those are salami slicing tactics. And this came up within the context of that podcast episode about dictators, because salami slicing tactics are often employed as a military strategy. So Tim was using these tactics to explain what Putin has done in Ukraine. So a couple of decades ago, if Putin had launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine, that could have provoked an enormous retaliation from the West. However, because he's instead chipped away at Ukraine's sovereignty and autonomy over decades, when he finally did come to launch his all-out invasion, the West kind of almost sat back bemused, like how have we arrived at this situation? Although Tim suggested that the all-out invasion was too big a slice of salami. So we'll see. That one's still yet to fully play out. But again, I thought this, like the cylinder model, really made sense of how some students chip away at standards and expectations. So, and it happens to me every single lesson. I wouldn't say this is a big problem, but it happens every single lesson. I'll tell students to work in silence. However, after a couple of minutes, I can hear whispering. It's quiet, but still it isn't silence. I might say something like, I told you to be silent. The student says to me, but we're discussing the work. And I think, okay, it does sound like they're discussing the work, and they are being quiet. It is quiet whispering. Okay, I'll let this one slide. So I kind of just give them a kind of face. But I leave them as they were. Then a few more pockets of whispering break out. And I think to myself, well, I've kind of allowed one pair of students to whisper quietly about the work. So I can't now tell all these other students to be quiet or to be silent, because that would be unfair. And then the whispering gets louder and conversations turn away from work to other things. And all of a sudden, I've got a noisy classroom where very few students are talking about the work. Lots of students aren't working, and those who are trying to work are now struggling against the noise. And I think I go through this cycle a few times in most lessons. And the cycle might only take It might take place over the course of 10 minutes. And usually after those 10 minutes, I bring students back to the front. We'll go through answers and I'll kind of reset for the next exercise. But how did they manage to go from being asked to work silently to having a very noisy classroom? Well, the students intuitively employed salami slicing tactics, and I allowed them to do it. They chipped away at the initial expectations, and all of a sudden we couldn't have been further away from the original instruction. So that happens for me. That happens to me quite regularly. And I think that there are other individual students who do this more habitually. So there are certain students for whom we just seem to have lower expectations, and perhaps certain classes for which we seem to have lower expectations. And I think that that's the accumulation of lots of salami slicing tactics. And so what's the solution here? Well, the solution that Tim suggested is to not give up a single slice of salami. So going back to my initial example, I asked for silence. After a few minutes, one pair of students were whispering to one another, and it seemed to be about the work, and I let it slide. The solution to combat these sorts of salami slicing tactics is not to let it slide, to say, okay, I appreciate that you're talking about the work, but I did ask for silence, and whispering isn't silence, so please work in silence. And I think this also explains why it can be very difficult. I've had this experience with a class that I've recently taken over in the past couple of months. They've been on cover for a very long time, and in that time they'd sliced a lot of salami, and it's been very difficult for me to bring the expectations and standards back up to where they should be. It's far easier to, at the very start with a class, to never give up a slice of salami than it is to try and reclaim the salami later on. In fact, it might be impossible to reclaim the salami later on. So yes, when it comes to expectations and standards, it's important never to give up a slice of salami. So those were the two ideas I wanted to discuss in today's episode. The first of two back-to-back episodes that I'm going to be recording. I hope you enjoyed. I'll leave links to what I've discussed today in the show notes. Please go and check it out if you're interested, and let me know how you think these two ideas, the cylinder model and the salami slicing tactics, let me know whether you think they make sense of your experience as a teacher, or how they apply to your experience as a teacher. I'd be very interested to hear. We'll talk again soon, very soon, in fact. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod, or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.